On a special occasion as it is, celebrating the 225th anniversary of the Constitution, and also a very special acquisition here at Mount Vernon, we're glad that you could all make the trip down the Potomac and to George Washington's home. We have two presentations today. I know that Professor Brunsman, who you know well, will be talking a little bit, providing some historical context. And then we're also joined by my colleague, Stuart McLaren, our Vice President for the Fred W. Smith National Library for the Study of George Washington. And he'll talk a little bit more about the special item you'll see on display today. So welcome, and we'll get started right away with your professor.
Thanks, Jamie. I hope everybody's taking notes because I think he's charted the perfect life course. 4 years at the George Washington University and then a career at Mount Vernon. It's terrific. We appreciate Jamie and everyone here at Mount Vernon hosting us today. It's a real thrill in the middle of the semester to be able to come to Mount Vernon. And we're here for Constitution Day. 225 years ago today, on September 17th, 1787, the delegates at Philadelphia adopted the Constitution of the United States. It took several more months for the states to ratify the document, but the basic framework for a new government for America was in place. The framing of the Constitution is sometimes likened to a miracle, the miracle at Philadelphia. But it was in fact much harder than that. It took much discussion, negotiation, debate, some conflict, and ultimately compromise until the final product was ready. All of that took place over 5 months between May and September of 1787. And when the delegates weren't working in Independence Hall in Philadelphia, they did overtime at Philadelphia's City Tavern. And so I think this is maybe an appropriate work model for a college. As long as you produce something as brilliant as the Constitution, it's okay. Well, given our location today and the celebration of Mount Vernon's recent acquisition of Washington's copy of the Constitution, I want to say a few words about what he meant to the framing and the adoption of the document. To a man, all the delegates at the Constitutional Convention would have said that it would have been impossible for the document to come about without Washington. But why? Well, the easy answer is that he was president of the convention. But in practice, all this really meant was he sat higher than everyone else, truly. He sat elevated and in a very high-backed chair that had a sun on it that people remarked about. As president, he was prevented from actually participating in the debates in the framing of the Constitution. He didn't make any notable speeches or issue any opinions. Moreover, like the other delegates, he was sworn to secrecy. So we don't have a really good idea of what Washington was thinking or feeling during those days in Philadelphia. There's a repetitive sentence that's in his diary for those months, and it says, "Attended convention as usual." So again, how could it be that someone who is not responsible for a single idea, really, in the Constitution be credited as essential to the entire enterprise? The answer is that Washington lent legitimacy to the convention and to the document that it produced. America is sometimes referred to as the indispensable nation. Well, Washington was the indispensable founder. He was the one person that had the entire trust of the nation. That trust was certainly built during his days as a general in the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War, and in his harrowing victories in places like Trenton and Princeton and Yorktown. But in truth, Washington lost as many battles as he won. The thing that really forged trust with the American people didn't have anything to do necessarily with what Washington did. It's what he didn't do. He didn't try to retain power after the war ended. It was very notable that at the end of the war, he resigned his commission to Congress and returned here to Mount Vernon. And who could blame him? There's no better example of the civilian control of the military, which is a central bedrock of our American Republic. So in this and in other acts, Washington acted constitutionally even before the Constitution existed. Of all the founders, he might be the hardest to understand. And I've said this in class, that it takes some grounding in the 18th century in culture and the politics of the time to appreciate his greatness. As much as we want to turn him into an action hero, which he kind of was, it's more important to understand why he was respected in his day, and that was for his comportment and for the way that he wielded and often rejected power. A story from the Constitutional Convention helps to illustrate Washington's appeal to his contemporaries. A group of old friends from the war were gathered together, and they were remarking on Washington's amazing reserve, when one of them, a guy named Gouverneur Morris, said that he could be just as familiar with Washington as he could with any of his friends. And Morris was something of a rake. He was an interesting guy. He had a peg leg, and depending on the source, there's different stories about how that happened. His carriage either had an accident, or he heard it jumping out of the window of one of his married lovers just to escape being discovered. But in any case, he was a talented rake. He actually drafted much of the language in the Constitution, including the very important opening words, "We the people." And so Alexander Hamilton called Morris's bluff. And he said, well, if you can talk to Washington that way, why don't you go up to him, slap him on the shoulder, and say, "My dear General, how happy I am to see that you look so well." Well, when Morris actually tried this, there were predictable results. We have to remember that Washington was a tall man for his day, about 6'2". He turned, looked at Morris, took his hand off his shoulder, and Morris backpedaled across the room. Washington didn't have to say a word. As the eminent Yale historian Edmund Morgan has explained, this aloofness was cultivated and deliberate. We might mistake it for arrogance, but actually it reflected Washington's genius for understanding power and how to exercise it in his time. With such stature, it's even more notable that he accepted the premise of Republican government, that his power was subordinate to Congress's, that no man was above the law. When some of his officers conspired to seize power at the end of the Revolutionary War, mainly because they hadn't been paid on time, he put down the movement immediately. When it was suggested to him that he should be running the country instead of Congress, he rebuked the notion by responding that he could not have found a person to whom your schemes are more disagreeable. In December 1783, Washington delivered the address in which he resigned his commission. And he said, "Having now finished the work assigned to me, I retire from the great theater of action, and I here offer my commission and take my leave of all the employments of public life." This single action stunned the Atlantic world. The painter John Trumbull was in London at the time, and he reported that Washington's retirement excites the astonishment and admiration of this part of the world. 'Tis a conduct so novel, so unconceivable to people who, far from giving up powers they possess, are willing to convulse the empire to acquire more. It was enough to impress another George, George III, who predicted that if Washington truly retired from public life and returned to his farm, he will be the greatest man in the world. Well, Washington really did retire, and he meant it. He was perfectly satisfied and happy here at Mount Vernon, and it's easy to see why. It took some coaxing to get him to attend the Constitutional Convention. He didn't decide until March of 1787, 2 months before it began, that he was actually going to go. And when he finally made the decision, it wasn't that he wanted to regain the power that he had earlier relinquished, quite the opposite. He wanted to come to the rescue of the Republic that was really floundering under the weak Articles of Confederation. Once he decided to go, he wrote to John Jay, "Among men of reflection, few will be found, I believe, who are not beginning to think that our system is better in theory than it is in practice, and that notwithstanding the boasted virtue of America, it is more probable we shall exhibit the last melancholy proof that mankind are not competent enough to their own government without the means of coercion in the sovereign." Who better than Washington to prove that a republic could exist with a strong national government that would not take away the liberties that had been secured by the Revolution? Once he was no longer sworn to secrecy, Washington made clear that the new government framed in Philadelphia had his enthusiastic blessings. Still, it took some coaxing again for him to stand for president. Upon hearing that Washington had hinted about rejecting the presidency, Hamilton reminded him that by chairing the Constitutional Convention, he had pledged to take a part in the execution of the government. Having survived Washington's icy glare, Gouverneur Morris had the courage to write him, "I have observed that your name attached to the new Constitution has been of infinite service. Indeed, I am convinced that if you had not attended the convention and the same paper had been handed out to the world, it would have met with a colder reception. As it is, should the idea prevail that you would not accept to the presidency, it would prove fatal in many parts. Well, of course, eventually Washington gave in and agreed to stand for president. After his election, talk began again of him ruling as some type of monarch. One supporter wrote to him, "You are now a king under a different name, and I am well satisfied that sovereign prerogatives have in no age or country been more honorably obtained." This was dangerous talk in the Republic, and Washington knew it. He worked hard to dispel these notions. It's significant that whatever his private ambitions may have been, he always presented himself publicly as disinterested. As he embarked on the journey in 1789 to take the oath of office in New York, he wrote to Henry Knox, "My movements to the chair of government will be accompanied with feelings not unlike those of a culprit who is going to the place of his execution." How many of us feel before an exam or some other event? Well, we know the end of the story. Washington, however miserable, lived up to the trust that the American people had placed in him. There's no better evidence of that than the copy of the Constitution that's here today, in which Washington has jotted notes in the margin about his particular duties and powers. It's hard to imagine a dictator or a monarch doing the same thing. Again, for all the important things he did as president, none was more significant than giving up power once again after his second term, even though everyone around him was pleading for him to continue. Imagine if he would have taken on a third presidential term and died. The precedent that would have set for the Republic, that the presidency was something akin to a lifetime appointment. Benjamin Franklin was correct on the final day of the Constitutional Convention, 225 years ago, when he described staring at the presidential chair in which Washington had sat for several months. Franklin wrote, "I have often in the course of the session looked at that sun behind the president without being able to tell whether it was rising or setting. But now at length I have the happiness to know that it is a rising and not a setting sun." The delegates then retired to the city tavern for one last meal and drink together, which reminds us that as much as this is an occasion for somber and respectful reflection, it's also a time for celebration. And it's certain that at that tavern, there was at least one huzzah that was exclaimed by the delegates. So I think it's only appropriate in the celebration of the Constitution today that we have 3 huzzahs for the Constitution. All right, you ready? You with me? Huzzah! 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 All right, very good. Thank you very much. And as Jamie mentioned, this is Stuart McLaren, Vice President of Mount Vernon and the Director of the new Smith National Library for the study of Washington.
Thank you, Dr. Brunsman. Thank you very much. It's a wonderful opportunity for us to have you here at Mount Vernon today. And in the 154 years since the Washington family sold Mount Vernon into the private hands, the very private but capable hands of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, there have been only 20 regents of that group. And today we are honored to be joined by the 20th regent of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, Ann Bookout. Of the great state of Texas, I might add. And also, to show that sometimes presidents outlast regents, there have only been 10 presidents in the 154-year history of Mount Vernon being in private hands since the Washington family. And just last week, we were honored to announce Kirk V. Brantz as the 10th president of George Washington's Mount Vernon. And so our room this afternoon is bookended by these 2 great leaders that are leading Mount Vernon into the future. This is a very exciting day. As we've heard and as we've talked about, we're celebrating the 225th anniversary of the Constitution of the United States. Just a few feet from where we're standing right now, where you're seated right now, is George Washington's copy of that incredible historic document, where, as we've heard, he in his own hand marked and noted the roles and responsibilities of the President of the United States. He didn't have a predecessor. He didn't have someone he could consult to what being the president is like. He had to take the meat of our Constitution and go through it line by line, and I believe in 11 places mark those roles and responsibilities. We have something a little more special that's seasoning this special document that we have obtained here, and that is a document that's on loan to us from the National Archives. So you'll see this wonderful Constitution of George Washington's, and next to it, we have the draft from the National Archives. And he actually did submit to the Secretary of the Constitutional Convention his comments. Although he didn't speak publicly in the debate, he noted to the Secretary of the Congress his own annotations and comments. And you'll see side by side the Constitution that we have and the draft document from the National Archives. My job today is to introduce to you a brief video that will tell the exciting story of how we acquired this document this summer. And you've already met the star of this video, the Regent, who I don't want to steal her thunder or the exciting words of this video. But if you've never been to Mount Vernon before, you've come on a wonderful day. And I hope that as we are in the process of building the Presidential Library for George Washington, which is my honor and role here, is to help build this great presidential-style library that's just across the street from where we're standing. There are 14 libraries in the National Archives Presidential Library System. And although we're not one of those, because those are all government-funded, and Mount Vernon does not accept a single dollar of government money. There's no federal dollars, no state dollars that go into Mount Vernon. It's all privately funded. We will be of the stature or surpass the stature of those presidential libraries. So we're very excited to have that construction underway today. It'll be finished in late next spring. We'll open a year from now in September. And part of the work of that library is new partnerships and growing partnerships that we already have. Your university bears the name of George Washington, the first president of the United States, the man whose life, whose leadership, and whose legacy we are extending and serving here at Mount Vernon. And the partnership with George Washington University, as exemplified by this time with you here today, is very, very important to us and will continue to be important and grow with the new library that we open next year. So with that, I will say welcome to Mount Vernon, and we'll tee up the video.
My name is Ann Bookout, and I'm the 20th Regent of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. There were a number of leather-bound books that were presented to the founding leaders. Washington was given 7 of these books as acts of Congress. There were only 2 that were embossed in gold with the word President on the front. This is the only one that he ever wrote in the margins of.
Well, my name's Carol Cadieux, and I serve as the Robert H. Smith Senior Curator and Vice President of Collections here at Mount Vernon. The Acts of Congress has had a remarkable journey, and it is truly awe-inspiring to think of the fact that it is today in pristine condition and still so beautifully bound, just as it was in the 18th century, despite its remarkable journey. In this book, we see Washington and his colleagues really putting into printed form those concepts that they have been struggling with over the Constitutional Convention, where they have been laboring for many, sometimes very hot days, trying to figure out exactly the shape of the new nation. They all realized that they were setting precedents to be followed.
Well, the Ladies Association didn't know that the book was going to auction until after the catalog had already gone to print. The reason why I attended was because we wanted to have a representative in the room. We worked very hard to find a donor or an angel who would help bring this book home to Mount Vernon, because we are a nonprofit institution and we rely on no government money. We decided as a board to muster our resources and to go to the auction to be as competitive as we could possibly be.
And we have come now to a very proud moment. We are selling George Washington's personal copy of the Acts of Congress.
You could feel the energy in the room, And of course, as it neared the actual sale, it heightened. You knew it was a momentous occasion.
$3 million now, 3,200,000 lots of paddles. At 3,200,000 now, several paddles, 3,500,000 back to Paul.
And I was able to join the bidding after the first round of fast and furious bidding, but that was already at $5 million when I got in.
At 4,500,000, 4,800,000 back to Paul. $5 million with the lady again.
And it continued on until finally there were two bidders in the room.
8,600,000, 8,700,000. She's bidding all by herself.
I knew where my limit was. The board had given me strong marching orders, and I knew where we were going to stop.
Then selling for $8,700,000. And that goes to Mount Vernon.
And there was, I think, a real sense of joy that this rare piece of history was not going to go back into a drawer for another 50 years, that it was coming home to Mount Vernon where it was going to be shared with scholars who can see it for themselves and do research and write about the legacy of George Washington and the founding of this nation.
We're just absolutely delighted to be able to welcome it home after so many years, such a long journey, but clearly some very, very good caretakers in the meantime. George Washington is very, very exacting with his books, and we see that he takes great care of them. He has them in beautiful glass-fronted shelves in his personal library at Mount Vernon, often putting a wonderful flourish of his grand signature in the upper right-hand corner of the title page, which he does with this volume. He also often, especially on very important books, puts a terrific book plate. And this is a book plate that Washington ordered from England. It's engraved in London. This volume, I think, was probably pretty special to him because it has both his engraved book plate, his signature on the title page. But what is even more distinctive and more unusual is that Washington makes notes in the margin, and we almost never see Washington writing any marginalia. In several places, he very carefully brackets his powers and his role as president. We see him, for instance, in Article 1 of the Constitution here, bracketing and writing the words president next to those duties that he is to follow and how he is to follow the enacting of legislation, how you have bills that are ratified by Congress in the House of Representatives and in the Senate and then sent on to George Washington as president for either approval or veto. And then again in Article 2, you see him bracketing not only putting president, but also powers, which is an interesting word that he uses. And it shows the powers that he has to appoint justices to the Supreme Court, to ratify treaties, to appoint ambassadors. So he's really sort of understanding exactly those powers that are his and those that he must delegate to the other important branches of Congress.
To me, it struck me almost as he was looking at a manual, and this was the roadmap of what were his responsibilities. And I believe he was keenly aware of the use of the presidential power to further the public good. So it really, to see it in person, it's chilling.
He didn't mark uniformly everything that he was supposed to do as president, but what's interesting is that in one bracket he does note required. And I think this is very telling because it's really Washington noting what he absolutely must not forget to do. And that addresses the, what we would call today sort of the State of the Union address, the reports to Congress on the state of the nation.
The Acts of Congress will be on view in our Donald W. Reynolds Museum for the public to see, and we hope that we will be able to also take it around the country to different venues for people who cannot come to Mount Vernon. The book after that will be permanently housed in the Fred W. Smith National Library for the study of George Washington. This library will be a repository for all material on Washington will serve as a place for scholars to come and reside for short periods of time or up to 6 months or a year, research and write about George Washington. It is a presidential library, and in fact, George Washington wrote to a friend 2 years before he died. He said, "I have not houses to build except one to house my manuscripts, papers, and books, which are voluminous and may be of interest." So we are, after 200 years, building that library and bringing home the acts of Congress where it belongs.